You'll just have to wait until after the test. As I expected. God, what are you doing?
In every genre, there is a catalyst, a start of something new that everything that comes after it succumbing to its influence. It sets a new standard by its impact alone. Half-Life was the game in the FPS genre to do it. Its reach is infinite, in the same manner that Doom and Quake had cast its own shadow. But this game had done something more, had shown the genre that it could evolve to newer heights. The countless games we have today mirror the fusion of rich world building and storytelling combined with addictive gunplay. But well before that, there were just games like Doom and Wolfenstein, the build engine games like Duke Nukem 3D, Blood, Shadow Warrior, and several others. While they were known for pushing forward 2.5D FPS gameplay with improving sprites every year, they were ultimately lacking in the story department, something that RPG games like Ultima Underworld, Fallout 1 and 2, and Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment had significantly more of. In the mid-90s, story wasn't that important for the shooter genre. Usually they would just put in some background story to provide some context to your actions, what you were doing, and why you were doing it. But it would be some time until we'd see FPS games come out with a big push to tell a more interesting story, as well as developing an interesting universe with lore and things to discover. Half-Life, mind you, wasn't the first to make this effort, but it was the best game at the time to provide Quake-styled maps, combined with a novel-based approach to the game's storytelling. In it, we had the best of both worlds. The fast-paced gunplay of Quake, but with a more interesting story, with fully voiced characters to boot. Released by Valve in '98, the game that pretty much set the blueprint for just about every Valve game to come forward afterwards. When you play Counter-Strike or Portal or Left 4 Dead, Team Fortress Classic or 2, even Day of Defeat, it's rooted from the groundwork of the first Half-Life. You know when you play a game you can tell right away who it's from, and when a new game comes out from the same company you can tell it was going to be a banger no matter what? Well, at the time that was Valve, a company that had only gotten started and finally released one of the most groundbreaking shooters ever made. And so, I'm finally talking about the first Half-Life, something that I've been wanting to do for a long while. Now, the original Half-Life has been covered by a lot of people, and Half-Life 2 and its episodes even more so. This one will be more or less about my own feelings of the game, and how it's impacted my perception of what constitutes great game design and gameplay, on top of storytelling and use of sound. We have the big names such as Doom, Quake, and Halo being heralded as some of the most influential shooters ever made. Doom perfecting the template Wolfenstein 3D had provided, and had set the standard for Doom clones and build engine games to come later. Quake was the game that made the complete transition to 3D, bringing forth a level of 3D that would cement itself forever in the coming years, thanks to the programming genius of John Carmack and many others who had helped him, the implementation of binary space partitioning, a rendering technique that would help to create the Doom engine earlier and would be expanded upon even further in the Quake engine. And finally, Halo, the shooter that defined the console FPS market in the 2000s, up until the Modern Warfare entries, which in turn changed everything once again, and that became the popular series. But those two games at the end of the day have had the influence of Half-Life and what it accomplished washing over them, in the same way that Quake had cast its own shadow on virtually every shooter ever released, even Half-Life. But Half-Life, as I've said again and again, helped pioneer the method of applying effective storytelling in a novel format to a Quake-styled shooter. However, that merit alone would be underselling how awesome this game actually is and what else it's also done, and what it's done for the genre in its entirety. The start of its brilliance starts in a Skytram, deep underground in a place unknown, in the perspective of a character so iconic that you can tell who he is just from the face alone. Gordon Freeman, a scientist specializing in theoretical physics, assigned to undergo a test within the Black Mesa facility. The entire intro of this game indicates a number of things. You have living and breathing staff that you can interact with. There's no imminent danger as of yet, meaning that you get the opportunity to explore a portion of the everyday life of Black Mesa, with scientists and security guards inhabiting this place, as well as a particular fellow with a briefcase. Most shooters just get you in the thick of the action like in Doom and Quake, but Half-Life decides to take its time with the events that will eventually unfold. The intro is essentially the calm before the storm, and the way that this intro is handled would affect a good number of other games, so much so that even Doom 3 would do the same thing with the first level of that game, where you get to explore the facility and interact with the staff. It's a welcome change of pace and gives the player insight into the character, the world he inhabits, as well as the feeling of immersion. Now, of course, like any other thriller or action scene, there is a catalyst that sets everything in motion, and it all starts when you finally reach the test room. Beforehand, you hear other scientists talking about the other divisions within Black Mesa and their experiments. One area in particular, anomalous materials, which is where you work, have been experiencing technical issues, which is why you obtain the HEV suit in the first place, the same suit that you'll be wearing for the entire series. Anyway, you go into the chamber and things seem fine. That is until what they call a resonance cascade is created, causing a massive malfunction to occur and in effect, a massive invasion following after, plunging the entire facility into chaos. You'd think that this is where the action occurs, like in Doom or Quake. Well, yes and no. The thing is, you make your way back up and rely on the protection of the security guards, more or less, but it doesn't last long and eventually you end up having to defend yourself now that there's no other option. This was another way of creating anticipation for action, whereas in a lot of other old school shooters, like I said, you're immediately thrust into the action, but given the context of the character's background, you're not really a fighter, but the circumstances of the game's events eventually do evolve the character into becoming someone that is adaptable and capable in combat scenarios. With your trusty crowbar and your handgun, you finally have a means of fighting back the headcrabs and the zombies. You know, I didn't realize this until some time ago, but the lambda symbol for Half-Life resembles someone holding the crowbar, or someone holding the lambda. I know that's not exactly why it's there, but it's one of those subtle things that you don't quite realize until you actually think about it. Throughout the history of this game, people have gone down the endless rabbit hole of dissecting the magic of this game and what went behind it, not to mention the ability to pick it apart once the Gold Source engine was able to be worked with later after its release. In the case of modding anyways. One of the game's biggest strengths is the handling of the AI. More often than not, enemies will catch you off guard, even the smaller head crabs which can come out of nowhere, and sometimes it's hard to gauge whether they can reach you or not. In the case of the soldiers that you fight later, they're generally some of the more dangerous enemies in the game, given the fact that they can coordinate with each other like an actual team, flushing you out with grenades, moving out of the blast area of your own grenade, flanking you if given the opportunity. The Vortigaunts are also another enemy that you fight often, zapping you after a few seconds unless you hit them hard with a magnum shot or a few easy pistol shots. The roster of Half-Life is fantastic in its variety and environmentally makes sense here. The lab personnel reduced to zombified walking husks in endless pain from the head grabs on their head, the aliens and the soldiers roaming about the facility attacking anyone and each other. Part of enemy design is to also think of its place and its reasoning for being there. In Doom, the demons make sense in the confines of their own hellish domain, and even still in the UAC facility because of the invasion. Without the context of the story, you're just simply fighting whatever's being thrown at you, without any rhyme or reason. Your main goal is to survive and get out of Black Mesa. And throughout your journey, you explore many different parts of the facility and get the sinking feeling that it's a hell of a lot bigger than you initially thought. A place that is essentially a black site in the middle of nowhere that seems to go on forever. And each area has their own function and design that stand out. This is another way of background storytelling, without the need for words, and to let the place do the talking by showing you what it's about, and what could have went on before in the past, before the invasion even started. Even when you go outside, you can see the absolute shit show that is occurring between the military and the aliens. When they're not shooting at you, they're shooting at each other, meaning that the situation is even bigger than you initially thought. Again, this is also part of Half-Life's brilliant storytelling, showing not just dialogue between characters, but also through their actions too, eventually leading to the bigger picture once you finally reach the Lambda Labs, and what you actually have to do. Throughout your journey, before you reach that point though, you go through a tango with Black Ops units, almost get crushed, fight a gigantic alien with a flamethrower that eventually leads to an opportunity to airstrike it, a giant creature that you have to incinerate, and in between all of that are a few puzzles and set pieces that are laced throughout each chapter. Graphically speaking, it's a game that was way ahead of its time. The modifications taken from both Quake 1 and Quake 2's source code eventually led to the creation of the Gold Source engine that would push 3D graphics to even higher planes. More dynamic geometry, more display of colors, lighting and 3D modeling, you name it. It's a game that still has that low poly charm formed from the 90s, where it doesn't necessarily deter from the experience because of how good the gameplay is, as well as the overall experience. Gameplay that is both fun and at times, admittedly, really punishing. Half-Life was a pretty difficult game even back then, and you'll die often, usually from either failing platforming sections or just being unlucky with hit scans from the soldiers, or the alien grunts getting lucky hits with the hive hand weapon. Even with plenty of ammo and supplies, it's easy to get comfortable and risk avoidable mistakes. Mistakes such as not paying attention to enemies around the corner, or hitting a blue line that activates the turrets, or getting in the crossfire of a bunker with a machine gun or a sniper rifle, or even just not minding where you're standing and falling off to your demise. But the game wasn't hard to the point where it stopped being fun. It just happened to be more of a case of being a game that rewarded you for playing smarter and knowing what you were doing, understanding the situation that you were in and what you're up against. That's another thing. Lots of shooters make you evolve in your skill towards the game. In Half-Life, the character evolves with your skill. As I was saying earlier, Gordon Freeman was a character from a scientific background. He had never been put in a situation like this before, let alone in extreme combat situations. But through your familiarity and experience in the game, Gordon in effect becomes a more capable and competent fighter, taking out well-trained military forces and even Black Ops units, as well as the aliens that are running amok. This effect on the character comes from the fact that he's more or less a blank slate character with some background info. This is usually done to make the player feel more like the character, whereas in a lot of other games you're playing in the perspective of a fully fleshed out character. Final Fantasy VII's storytelling wouldn't be as impactful as it was if Cloud was just a blank slate character with nothing to say. Nowadays it's a bit jarring to have this sort of style of storytelling still occur in games with voice lines or other characters that are talking to you and you say nothing in return. But back then it was pretty normal, with some exceptions of course, like the first couple of Halo Bungie games, where the main character, the Master Chief himself, would talk in cutscenes but not in game. Either way, the storytelling was still effective in both the environmental part as well as the set pieces and the dialogue given, providing context to your actions and how your goal evolved over time. You go from trying to survive and getting out of the facility to stopping the invasion altogether. Beyond the story, you have the gameplay itself, which still holds up really well to this day. The physics, of course, leave a lot to be desired, especially when you compare it to its successor, Half-Life 2, which used the Source engine. But it wasn't really janky either. Movement was still smooth in the heat of combat, platforms were still manageable, albeit annoying sometimes, the range of weapons you have that are all quite good, and one of the expansion packs, Opposing Force, goes into full overdrive in terms of the arsenal, more on the expansions later. You have a mix of standard fare weapons on top of some more unique weapons like the crossbow, the Gauss gun, the glue-on gun, the hive hand, and the snark. While all of the weapons are quite effective, it's also a matter of which one is more useful against which enemy, not to mention that most of them have secondary capabilities, like with the MP5, which has a grenade launcher attached to it. Say you don't have enough time to throw a grenade, just use the launcher instead, or with the shotgun, fire 2 shells instead of 1. Things like this come into play when it comes to playing smarter, which is what makes these games easier over time in spite of the initial difficulty. The game just feels good to play even when there are annoying moments throughout the puzzle and combat sections. Being able to ignore the frustrations of a game no matter how much it tilts you is often a good sign. Some games can be frustrating to the point of sucking away the fun, and it's never a good thing. You won't really find that at all in this game. Beyond the campaign, you've got quite the package. It's got a multiplayer mode that still has some activity and is even extended by the presence of the Sven co-op mod. Its multiplayer is a standard deathmatch mode that's sort of like Quake. You have items and weapons to pick up and whoever gets the most frags wins. But its multiplayer scene is almost non-existent nowadays, with a pocket of people that do still play it. The rest of the population at the time had moved on to other games like Team Fortress Classic, Day of Defeat, Deathmatch Classic, and Counter-Strike. All of these games being based on the source code for Half-Life, some of them originating as mods and others being made by Valve themselves, like Deathmatch Classic for instance, which was in a way like a homage to the first Quake. But Half-Life's biggest strength is its rich single-player campaign, with detail packed into the environments, the atmosphere, the fun gameplay that is both challenging but fair, as well as the overall modding capabilities that it had going for it. During its lifespan, it would get 2 expansion packs released for it, Blue Shift and Opposing Force, which gives us different perspectives during the Black Mesa incident. Both were developed by Gearbox Software, with one being decent and the other being absolutely awesome. Blue Shift pits you as Barney Calhoun, a security guard working at Black Mesa who also happens to be in the same mess as everyone. And it starts off just like the first game where everything's fine until shit hits the fan. In this expansion, the weapons are pretty much the same as with the enemies. It's basically just more of Black Mesa to explore, alongside some other characters that you meet, as well as a few glimpses of the G-Man as well as Gordon Freeman himself. I personally enjoyed this expansion, but it's nowhere near as good as the next one, that takes everything into overdrive and provides a standard for what the expansion should be. Opposing Force. Now, if you had to play only one of the 2 available expansions, then this is the one to go to. This time you play as one of the soldiers, Adam Shepard, sent to clean up the mess at Black Mesa, as well as a number of other soldiers that are looking for Gordon Freeman as well. This time though, the invasion has already begun and your helicopter crashes after an attack. What's interesting about this game in particular is that you're in the perspective of a bad guy essentially. Well, depending on your actions anyway, whether you kill the scientists or the guards along your way. Like the previous expansion, you get to see a lot more of Black Mesa and some of the other divisions behind it. But this time you have even more weapons to play with on top of some new enemies to deal with. And while in this game you don't have to worry about your fellow soldiers shooting you, you do still have to deal with the Black Ops units after all, given that they have orders to kill anyone still remaining at Black Mesa. Expanding more on the government's involvement in the whole situation. You get a lot of new weapons that all feel good to play around with. In fact, there's even a weapon that teleports you or the enemy back to the border world, Zen, which I thought was a really cool trick implemented into this game. Then you have the barnacle weapon that eats head crabs or pulls you towards an object or an enemy. The expanded roster of weapons also complements the newer enemies too, having male Black Ops units acting in the same way as the soldiers but are much faster. Then there's the larger alien grunts that can also throw explosives at you, and these large bipedal creatures that take a fair bit to put down. You get a chunk of single player content when you combine the main campaign and the 2 available expansions all together that will keep you busy for quite some time. Any of the Doom games, some of the older Need for Speeds, and Fear are some of the games in my library that I always end up playing annually, and the Half-Life games are also the same in that regard. While my experience with Half-Life actually started with the second game, I eventually did play the remake known as Black Mesa, which by the way is absolutely fantastic and is a must play if you want a remake done right. But despite all of that, I would in time finally play the original Half-Life, being mindful that it was an older game and that I would have to get used to the more dated physics and graphics, which again was not an issue for me since I was already accustomed to old school graphics. So beyond the horizon of its single player as well as its own multiplayer, what else is left beyond the veil? Well, like Doom, Half-Life has a huge modding community, in both 1 and 2, that has produced some of the most iconic FPS games ever made, such as Counter-Strike, the multiplayer FPS in the 2000s that took the PC world by storm and would cement the end of Quake's reign in the multiplayer FPS scene. There was also Team Fortress Classic, something that was originally a mod for Quake 1, but would also be reiterated based on Half-Life's engine. Then you have Day of Defeat, a World War II equivalent of Counter-Strike that was pretty fun for a time, but wouldn't have the same lasting impact as Counter-Strike, a game that was easy to learn but hard to master. And it wasn't just mods that became their own games like Afraid of Monsters or Cry of Fear, but he also had a ton of other map packs or added campaigns like Half-Life Echoes and Half-Life Delta, giving you a complete campaign experience, as well as gameplay overhaul mods like Brutal Half-Life or M-Mod, giving you a familiar but far more enhanced gameplay experience. Even to this very day, people are still producing mods for the original Half-Life, even with the presence of the Source engine and the games that come with it. Those that are interested in making mods or maps for Half-Life, I would recommend they either obtain the Half-Life Source Development Kit on Steam, or Jack, also known as Just Another Creation Kit, a map editor that lets you make maps for not only Half-Life, but also the first 3 Quake games. You can either buy it on Steam or download the free version on their website. Over the years, the Gold Source engine would end up getting different forks alongside additional improvements. One example being Zash 3D, a fork of the Gold Source engine that makes mobile play possible. But as far as I know, while you can mod Half-Life 1 to a great degree, there's still the Source Development Kit and user license agreement to worry about. And if not followed accordingly, or if you use a modified version of the engine while trying to sell it, you may not be able to get your mod onto Steam. In terms of licensing, it's more limited to mod, unlike say Classic Doom, where the source code was released, allowing for essentially an infinite lifespan, as well as more freedom to mod the game as you see fit, even to the point of making your own games using GZ Doom. In fact, you can even sell your game using GZ Doom, but you can't do that with Half-Life 1, for you can only release your project for free. Which is why we've been seeing less and less total conversion mods over time, because of the existing engines and resources that are available today that allow you to make your own game without the red tape of using a company's in-house engine. But in spite of that, Half-Life 1's modding community is alive and well, and there's an incredible wealth of content to dive into and enjoy once you've exhausted the campaigns, and if you even played at all, the multiplayer. Half-Life 1 is one of those miracle projects that has pioneered and forever changed the way storytelling would be implemented in FPS games throughout the late 90s to the 2000s and to this very day. The desire to combine narration and dialogue alongside Quake-style gameplay gave the world the best of both sides of the coin, proving people like John Carmack wrong, where you could have a fun and engaging shooter with a great story at the same time. Half-Life's example would then be replicated into other FPS games. Now, I haven't forgotten about games like Deus Ex or System Shock, but the truth is that those games do a lot more than just being a shooter, giving you multiple choices to go about levels, and even incorporating other elements and mechanics from other genres. When I'm talking about first-person shooters, I'm strictly talking about games like Doom, Quake, Half-Life, and Halo, where shooting your way out is the core gameplay loop. Its legacy still lives on, in almost every shooter ever made, and without Half-Life, I honestly don't know if we'd ever have games like Team Fortress 2, or Left 4 Dead, or Portal, or Counter-Strike for that matter. Wolfenstein 3D was the groundwork, Doom would perfect it, Quake showed us a whole new dimension, and Half-Life was the one with not only a story to tell, but a wave that has been sailing forever. There's not much more to say about that really, the history tells the rest, as you can see it back then and as you can see it now, and most of my experiences in the FPS genre exist because of it. It's a game that had changed shooters forever, and will always be a masterpiece in game design and gameplay. Thank you for watching.
Time to choose. Wisely done, Mr. Freeman. I will see you up ahead. Who is responsible for this mess? Don't ask me. Shouldn't you be guarding some donuts and coffee right about now?
Guess you're a good guy, Corporal. Listen, you've got to get down below. There's something coming through, and it's the nastiest looking...